Recording. So, as I was saying, I'm the author of the Minnesota Small Business Owners Legal Survival Guide, and we are going to send that out as a gift along with the recording of this webinar. Now that I remembered to push the recording button, but don't worry, for those of you who are seeing this after, you really didn't miss anything. So we're just getting started. So, of course, an attorney would have a disclaimer, and this is mine. So while I am an attorney, today, for the purpose of this webinar, I am not your attorney. So the information that I'm giving is for informational purposes only, and we're only talking in the broadest of broad strokes. And even with what we're talking about, there's certainly more things that we could do a deeper dive into with a lot of technical details that I'm not going to bore you with. But that is to say, in this webinar, I'm not looking at you and your situation and giving you specific advice for your particular situation. And also that during this webinar, no attorney-client relationship is being formed here. So that's my disclaimer. So let's start with the employment framework, because everything that we're talking about today has to fit within this employment framework. The employment framework is kind of like, you could say, the foundation, or even like sort of a set of immutable laws, like, you know, how gravity always applies to those of us who are on this earth, right? These laws are always in play. The first one is at-will employment. So at-will employment is the default setting. And basically, unless you have an employment agreement that states otherwise, you can dismiss an employee at any time for any reason or for no reason, as long as it's not for an illegal reason. So when we talk about, like, as long as it's not for an illegal reason, we're looking at the reasons like the Civil Rights Acts, or, you know, the Age Discrimination Employment Act, or the American, you know, the Disabilities Act, things like that. So speaking of the Civil Rights Acts, there's many, and they all layer on top of each other. So the first one that we are going to be talking about is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which applies to employers with 15 or more employees. Now, you might be thinking, I don't have 15 employees, so does that mean that I'm open to discriminate, you know, with impunity? And the answer to that is no. We also have Section 1981 of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. We have the Equal Pay Act, which impacts, you know, COVID impacts less, but it's still at play for all of us. And of course, the state's Civil Rights Acts, the way that it works is the Federal Civil Rights Act sets the bar that, you know, to which no state can provide less protection, but a state can provide more protection for employees, and many states do. So in general, I would say to stay out of hot water, if you make sure that you are compliant with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, whether you have 15 employees or less, generally you're going to be doing the right thing. So Title VII is the one that you might be familiar with that provides for you may not discriminate on race, color, religion, gender, pregnancy, or national origin. So the law regarding this is also now, and thankfully, rightfully settled, that sexual orientation and transgender status is protected under the basis of sex. And that came down from the US Supreme Court just last year. So yay. So the next piece of the framework that we look at is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. So that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in many areas. like employment, transportation, public accommodations, communications, access to government benefits. And it's integral as part of this conversation about COVID. The next one is the Age Discrimination Employment Act that forbids discrimination against people who are aged 40 or older. I never really would have considered myself at my age to be, a protected class, but it turns out that I am. The more gray hairs I get, right? And then the last one that is really pertinent to what we're talking about is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act of 2008, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of genetic information with respect to health insurance and employment. So that's the framework. The next thing to look at, the next layer to look at is, as employers, what are your obligations to your employees? And for that, we look at the rules that OSHA has set out, and that's the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So OSHA has set like many duties in a wide range of topics, and we're not going to cover all of those because that would take up all of our time. But I'm going to hit on the things that are the most pertinent to this, COVID-19 conversation. So you have a general duty, and that is a general duty to have a place of employment which is free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm. So whether it's COVID times or not, that's your base duty. There's also the standards that OSHA has set up for when personal protective equipment needs to be used, and in the hazard assessment for that. And workplace hazards that require PPE, like respiratory protection, can be used when necessary to protect workers and employers. Employers are workers. Well, yeah, employers and workers and their, clients that come in, their customers. And just like how state civil rights can be more restrictive, more protective than the federal, many states also have more restrictive and more protective OSHA requirements, on top of what is required under federal guidelines. So I'm not assuming that everybody's in Minnesota. I am licensed in Minnesota and Oklahoma, but I am speaking today in the most general terms. So I'm not necessarily speaking in terms of any particular state. So wherever it is that you are operating, it's going to be important for you to know what are your state's rules as far as when PPE must be used in what hazards. Okay, then the next relating to COVID-19 is that employers have a duty to protect workers from exposure to cleaning and disinfection chemicals. I mean, other chemicals as well, but in this context, cleaning and disinfection chemicals. And then generally, employers have the duty to record and report occupational injuries and illnesses. And if you have an employee that comes to you and reports that they have an injury or an illness, or if they report like, hey employer, you're not doing what you need to do to keep me safe under OSHA, you can't retaliate. When somebody reports that, think of it like the whistleblower. You can't then turn around and say, you know what, you're a crank, you're fired. So as an employer with a duty to furnish a safe working environment and prevent workplace exposure to COVID-19, like, how do you ensure that you're fulfilling on that duty? Because you don't want to be found falling down on that duty, right? And really, you have two choices in regards to COVID, right? You can either have a mandatory vaccine policy that's, of course, compliant with the law, or, you can have a voluntary policy that is also compliant with the law. So some people are like, really, can you actually have a mandate that your employees get vaccinated? And the answer to that is yes. Yes, but. And there's a lot that comes after that word but. But before we get into the details of that, there's some contextual concerns, some like broader concerns that I want you to take into account. So let's go through that. So first, only 63% of employed Americans are likely to get vaccinated. So that leaves 37% who will not be willing to get vaccinated, unless they're compelled by something like a mandatory vaccine policy, or if they're given a motivating incentive. 52% of employed Americans would support their employers in making vaccines mandatory for the workplace and do not want to return to work alongside unvaccinated coworkers. And then almost 40% of employed Americans believe, well, that should be believe, sorry, typo, that vaccines should be mandatory for everyone who is able to receive them, whether they're workers or not, like just everybody. So really, when you look at this, there's some strong supporters for a mandatory vaccine policy. And those people are in the slim majority. But this is by no means one of those situations where it's a clear-cut, uncontroversial issue. So if it's really, controversial out in the world, it'll be controversial in your workplace as well. And so if you go that way, just know there's likely going to be some pushback. So here's something else to take into account. Some groups of people have greater barriers to getting the vaccine than others. In general, people without computers have a harder time navigating that vaccine registration, whether that's, sponsored by, well, there's ones that are sponsored by the state, there's ones that are going on through, private groups where they help people, do vaccine locators and things like that, but they're all online. And I know that they've set up some hotlines, English speaking, and some other, like foreign language speaking. I know that there's a Spanish one. I don't know about other languages. But even getting information about those hotlines is kind of difficult without a computer. It's just in the normal day-to-day goings on of most people, they're not seeing necessarily the information presented from other, media sources that say, hey, this is where you call to get a vaccine, or here's where the information is. So people without computers are having a harder time getting the vaccine. They're having a harder time even getting information about the vaccine. There's a whole bunch of people who they got their first vaccine, and then the providers had to call them over and over and to follow up to say, hey, you didn't show up for your second appointment. And the people said, oh, I didn't know I needed a second appointment. I mean, there's just, for people who are computer savvy, it might be surprising that there's kind of an information gap. But it turns out that out in the world, there really is. So some people have that as a barrier. And another barrier that some people have is if they can't afford to take the time off to go and get the vaccine, and especially if they can't afford to take the time off to be out sick if they have side effects from getting the vaccine, they're less likely to be willing to go get it. Or they might just put it off, like, oh, I'll do it eventually, but it's certainly not a high priority in those cases. I mean, if you have to choose between working a day that allows you to keep food on your table, and feed your children, you're going to do that, right? So for these barriers, there are certain groups that these barriers are more prevalent at. Like if you look at like who statistically doesn't have a computer, well, generally that's like low income people and sometimes the aged, right? Like some people who are aged just aren't into computers, right? Um, and then statistically, who is the group who can't afford to take time off work? Well, again, low income workers. And who statistically as groups are low income? Well, people of color, immigrants, and the aged. And I'm not saying that should be, I'm saying that is statistically, that is so. And who are these three groups of people? Well, they're protected classes, which as employers, you need to take care not to create policies that have what's called a disparate impact on those people. When you create policies that influence a protected class, as opposed to unprotected classes, that's a violation of the Civil Rights Act, right? And so when you're thinking about putting policies together, especially if you're making a mandatory vaccine policy for your business, you'll need to take extra care that you carefully construct the policy and even possibly provide access yourself to the information that people need. Hand out that information, and you can even host an on-site, vaccination clinic for your people. And that would eliminate those barriers. It's just, you want to at least make it possible for people to go and comply with your policy as easily as possible. And if you have people who normally you wouldn't provide, a paid day off if they had if they were sick, you might make it a policy to say, okay, we're going to give you paid time off to go get the vaccine if it's not in-house, right? And we're going to give you a paid day off if you have some side effects. So removing those barriers are important. And then, the last sort of piece of this context is some people just have anxiety around this whole subject. Either they have anxiety about whether the vaccine is safe, whether it's been tested enough, whether it's going to be effective against all these variants, how long, the protection is going to last, whether it's even a good idea, right? And opinions vary, even amongst the experts on some of these aspects. So it's no wonder that, some people just don't know what to believe. So there are some people, you probably have noticed out in the world, that there are some people who think that their personal point of view or feeling about it, is something akin to a constitutional right, and that their personal liberty is at stake. And in their viewpoint, each to their own, regardless of the impact to others. And that's kind of like one camp, right? And then there's others, who think the safety of the group is as important as, one's own personal safety, and those people would be willing to take a vaccine, but they just don't feel confident about it yet. They feel like it's too new, it's not tested enough. They want to make sure that, that however many months down the road that we're not going to start seeing these ads on TV, have you been injured by a COVID vaccination, call such and such injury lawyers, right? I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why, like, people have anxiety about that. So if you have a mandatory vaccine policy, that's compliant with the law, of course, and it creates a lot of controversy within your workplace will that be disruptive to business? You'll have to think about that. Will it be disruptive to my business? Or if someone or a handful of people decide to quit because of the vaccine policy, will that impact your business? You know, do you have is it easy to replace people in the type of business you have? Or is it kind of like, oh, when we bring somebody on and we invest in that training, that, you know, it's going to be a problem if we have a bunch of people leave, you know, or, oh goodness, if you have to fire somebody for refusing to get vaccinated, and within the bounds of the law, of course, you know, will that damage, you know, your workplace morale? You know, morale is just as important as any other aspect of productivity. So what I'm saying is, even though you can or you could have a mandatory vaccine policy, should you? And now I'm not saying that you should or you shouldn't. You know, different workplaces have different needs and different risks. But these are some things that you need to have on your radar, though. Like, I don't want you to just look at, oh, okay, this is what I can do under the law, and not take a broader, holistic view. And like, as lawyers, we're always looking for what's the unintended consequence and try to head those off. So if you're going to have a mandatory vaccine policy, it would really be better for you to have a strong business case to do so, especially when you're sharing that with your employees, the employees who are going to be resistant to it. Why does it have to be a mandatory policy? And you can say, here's why: because in our situation and in our workplace, these are the facts and these are the risks, and it makes more sense for everybody to be vaccinated here. You know, because of the nature of the business and the way we all work in this environment, you know, you need to have a case that says, you know, the protection of staff and the people coming in, you know, outweighs your sense of personal liberty. Not that, you know, your sense of personal liberty is bad or wrong. It's just these are our competing factors, and this one weighs more. And in reality, just so you know, although you'll know in a few slides, you really can't create a truly mandatory vaccine policy without any exceptions, you know, because that's just not how the law works. And, you know, that framework that we talked about there at the beginning, your policy still has to work within that framework. Otherwise, you will get sued and you will lose, and it will be brutal. Okay, so with all that broader context, now we're going to finally get down to business. So here's what you need to know about making a voluntary vaccine policy. So this is kind of like the nitty-gritty parts. This is probably the part that you tuned in for, right? Okay. You can require all employees who are physically entering your workplace, not the people who are going to be solely working from home, but when they're physically entering your workplace, to be vaccinated, but of course, subject to reasonable accommodation for disabilities, pregnancy, or a sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance. So disability and pregnancy is under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance is under Title VII. So if you're going to have this mandatory policy, you must allow for these exceptions. You cannot say we're not going to allow for them. And of course, as we talked about before, those barriers, you can't discriminate against protected classes. You need to craft your mandatory policy in such a way that it removes those barriers. And then, when possible, and we're going to talk about that here in a second, you know, you have to provide reasonable accommodations. All right, so okay, let me give you a general definition of reasonable accommodation, and then we'll talk about it specifically under the ADA and specifically under Title VII. So a reasonable accommodation is one that does not pose an undue hardship on the business, which means something different under those two, and allows the employee to do the essential functions of their job. So when I say essential functions, there's a lot of people whose job description has like a whole laundry list of things that they do. Or sometimes people are wearing more than, you could say people are wearing more than one hat. But when it comes down to what you have to make sure that people are able to do is really the core functions of their job. If there's something that is not core to their job and they can't do it because they're not vaccinated, but it's kind of part of the lower level ancillary things that they do, that is not going to that's not going to cut it. So if they can do their essential functions with accommodations, you have to give them the accommodations. So let me go back. Well, I can stay here, but let me say this. In the context of COVID, common accommodations are, having people wear a face mask or other face coverings, like those shields are fine, maintaining social distancing, working an alternate shift. Maybe if everybody else is in, all the people who are vaccinated and or most of the people are in, 9 to 5, but the person has a position that allows them to be working off hours. Maybe you make the accommodation that they come in off hours when there's fewer people around. Sometimes those people could be given a non-shared workspace, like maybe normally they share a cubicle, but because of the reasonable accommodations, they can use the small office that they don't have to share, that's kind of off from everybody else. Or working from home is a great accommodation, right? Depending on if they're still able to do the essential functions of the job. If they're a receptionist and their job is to be at the front desk and greet clients, obviously they're not going to be able to work from home. And then sometimes accepting a reassignment. You normally work, for this person in this role, but you're qualified to do this other role, and we have an opening in this other role. Accepting that other role can be a reasonable accommodation. But of course, there are some jobs where all of those things, are not possible. They're just not, right? Or there's not a reasonable accommodation that is effective in allowing somebody to perform the essential functions of their job. So that's how reasonable accommodations work. Hi, Mary. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for your question. Is the employer required to provide a reasonable accommodation if the employee is not disabled or pregnant? Well, under Title VII, yes, and that would be for a sincerely held religious belief, which we're going to go to next. But if the employee, let's say if they're not disabled, they're not pregnant, they don't have if they don't have a sincerely held religious belief, but they just have like generalized kind of anxiety about it, no, employers aren't necessarily then required to provide a reasonable accommodation. Now, of course, as employers, if you can reasonably accommodate people, and you should, right? In general, I mean, like, people are hard to replace once they're trained. But that's how that works. Okay, so here's how under the ADA. So these are the general mechanics of the ADA applied to COVID. So you may require someone with a disability to meet a qualification standard that applies to all employees. Now, in general terms, I think like sometimes that's, can you lift 30 pounds, or are you able to stand on your feet for X number of hours a day, or whatever. I mean, there's qualification standards, right? One of them is a safety related standard requiring COVID-19 vaccination, if that's something that is necessary in your space. So the job standard has to be job related and consistent with the business necessity. Well, certainly there's a business necessity to, not spread this infection, as much as we can in our workplaces. So if a particular employee can't meet the safety related qualification standard because of a disability, so translate that to say, if somebody cannot receive a COVID-19 vaccination because of their disability, the employer may not require compliance for that employee unless it can demonstrate that the individual would pose a direct threat. That's the magic word, direct threat, to the health and safety of the employer or others in the workplace. So here is the definition of a direct threat, the magic words. It is a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of the individual or others that cannot be eliminated or reduced by reasonable accommodation. So in the regular mechanics of this analysis that we do, there's a series of factors that have to be individually considered for that person to determine if there's a direct threat in that particular case. So this first test, if there's a direct threat, has really already been handled. The EEOC, who is the governing body, that's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, determined that COVID was a direct threat. They determined that way back, when the pandemic began. So that hurdle done. Next test, check that off. But the next test after that is whether or not a reasonable accommodation that does not pose an undue hardship on the business would reduce or eliminate the risk. So under the ADA, that undue hardship is one that is a significant difficulty or expense. So really, it would have to be really something for you to say, oh, it's an undue burden to us. So a little bit of hassle just doesn't get you off the hook. So really, you as employers need to know that when somebody has this disability under the ADA, that you need to really make really some strenuous efforts to accommodate. Now, here's something too, that there can be people who wouldn't otherwise have a disability, but because of the nature of COVID, let's say they are immune compromised and they have a super heightened risk, even with a vaccination. The vaccination doesn't keep you from having COVID or getting it. It just keeps you, from having such a bad case that you end up dead, right? But somebody who is, has a compromised immune system, that might not be true, right? We don't know that yet. So for that person, in this context, they might actually have a disability under the ADA, where they come to you and say, hey, even vaccinated, I really need these reasonable accommodations that are going to keep me safe, right? And so that's something for you to just know. I want you to know that, have it on your radar. It can happen. So if there is a reasonable accommodation that's possible, then you must allow it. And of course, if no reasonable accommodation if no accommodation exists, then if no reasonable accommodation exists that allows them to do the essential functions, then you can terminate them. If there's no reasonable accommodations, allows them to do their ancillary things, but the reasonable accommodations allows them to do their essential functions, you can't fire them. So really, my advice though is that if you are going to terminate somebody who is, subject to, they have this disability under this standard. You need to get your ducks in a row, really, and have the whole situation super well documented before you do that termination. The instant you do that termination, their record is pretty much sealed up, and you can't go in and backfill their personnel record to say, oh, well, this is what we should have documented, but we didn't, and we'll be able to get that in as evidence. No, that's not how that works. So yeah, my advice would be to definitely, before you let somebody go, to work with counsel to make sure that you do have all of your ducks in a row. Okay, and if you do have somebody who is working under a reasonable accommodation under the ADA, you can't disclose to any others, like their coworkers, that person is receiving a reasonable accommodation, and you can't retaliate against somebody because they are getting a reasonable accommodation, or even that they came and asked for it. That's just one of the protected things. So let me look at my notes and make sure that I got everything. Did I say everything? I did. Okay, good. And we're good on time. So now we're going to shift, still in the category of civil rights, but under Title VII. So once you know that an employee has a sincerely held religious belief that prevents them from getting vaccinated, you must allow reasonable accommodations that don't pose an undue hardship. So under Title VII, undue hardship has a different definition than under the ADA. So the definition under Title VII is really having more than a minimal cost or burden on the employer. So in this case, a little more than a bit of hassle can be enough. So under Title VII, however, just so you know, the definition of religious beliefs is broad, way broader than you might think. Different things that you would think, is that really religion? Is a religious belief, right? So, and generally, unless you have a really good reason to suspect otherwise, you should just take somebody's word for it. When they say, I have this religious belief, and they may not even use the word. They probably won't even realize to use the word religious belief. What they're going to do is they're going to say, I have this belief that whatever. And because of this belief, I am forbidden to get a vaccination, right? That's pretty much how that works. So unless you have a really good reason to think that, no, they're not actually sincere about that, you should just take them for their word when they say that, right? Now, if you really do believe that somebody is just making it up, I mean, you have the right. You have the right to ask for further information. But really, I encourage you not to be that person. It's just, if you have a question about it, if you're in that situation, this would be one of those cases to talk that through with legal counsel. Yeah, you just don't want to be on the wrong side of that. And again, like under the Americans with Disability Act, if a reasonable accommodation exists, then you must allow the accommodation. And if there's no reasonable accommodation that would allow that person to do the essential functions of their job, you can terminate them. And just like I had said before, same sort of thing. Oh, it's smart to have the situation well documented in advance before you do anything. It doesn't matter if you're having to defend a lawsuit against the, because they bring it under Title VII versus the ADA. It's still onerous. It's still expensive. It's still brutal. So yeah, before you do that, get your ducks in a row. So here's some additional things. When you have a mandatory vaccine policy, you can ask for proof that the employee has gotten the vaccine. You know, a lot of people, you know, we're getting those cards. Some people are getting those cards. Some people are getting like a sort of like an online portal that's keeping track of it. And of course, most of us are getting vaccinated, you know, outside of the workplace. So if you ask for that proof, you have to keep that vaccine record confidential, and you have to store it somewhere separate, like in a medical record file separate from their personnel file. And that's not just COVID. I mean, that's part of the law and how you keep medical information, employee medical information separate from personnel and keep it confidential. But you just may not know, if you don't normally handle that, you know, this vaccine record falls under that, and that's how you need to handle it. And then here really is a trap for the unwary. And that is, you can ask for proof, but if someone says that they aren't getting vaccinated, you can't ask them why. This is going to sound goofy, but follow me here. As an employer, you cannot ask, it's the rule, you cannot ask anything that will lead someone to disclose a disability. And so if you ask them, oh, why aren't you getting vaccinated? And then they say, well, I have this disability and it doesn't allow me to get vaccinated. All of a sudden, you as the employer have put yourself in a precarious situation. So this is what you need to do instead. The thing to do is to have a written vaccine policy that you hand out to everybody, every single person that's an employee. And in that policy statement, you let them know about the exceptions under the ADA and Title VII, and then you provide them with the process, as in who to contact and what to request regarding requesting a reasonable accommodation. So that's how you handle that, because they need to come to you and say, I have this disability and this is how I want you to handle it. What we don't want is for you to ask questions that uncovers, that's impermissible, that uncovers a disability. Okay, so that's what we have for mandatory. Now let's talk about voluntary vaccination policies. Many employers, actually most employers, are turning to voluntary vaccine policies because they want to avoid that sort of sticky culture, controversy issues that can impact, you know, business performance and create divisiveness within their workplace, and can impact morale. And so they're opting instead for incentives that will help encourage as many people as are willing to get vaccinated. And then having an alternate policy for those who don't want to be vaccinated, that, you know, it's kind of the reasonable accommodation policy. You know, you have to wear face masks, you social distance, and whatnot, right? And for the people who don't get vaccinated, it could be for whatever reason, or it could be for no reason. And you know, the reasons, you know, aren't going to be inquired about, right? So about the incentives, though, an incentive, and this isn't just for COVID, this piece of the law flows out of when employers have wellness programs, they can incentivize employees taking advantage of those wellness programs, like going to the gym or stopping smoking or you know, things like that. But the incentive cannot be so substantial as to be coercive. So you can't create an environment where, you know, it's an offer you can't refuse, right? All right, some common incentives are cash, although not tons of cash, right? Extra time off, gift cards, swag. It's surprising to me always how much people love swag. You know, your you know, branded things. Not that that's branded, but anyway, you know what I mean. So talking about the swag route, though, some people thought, oh, it'd be fun to do something like a little button that said like, I vaccinated, similar to we get those I voted stickers. And that is like, no, don't do that. Because that can be seen as engendering like a peer pressure culture to have people get vaccinated, and that's considered coercive. So if you're going to do swag that is nice, right? But not actually tied or advertising that vaccine sort of status. Okay. And then here's another thing. Remember at the beginning, I said that GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So because of that law, if you're going to have an incentive program, here's how it needs, and you want to incentivize employees' families. If you want to incentivize that the whole family gets vaccinated, and you want to do that by supplying incentive to the employee, you need to be super careful about that, in that you can ask for proof that they got vaccinated, like family members got vaccinated, CVS pharmacy, you got vaccinated, great, you get the incentive. Where you have to be very careful is that if you offer the family members to be vaccinated in-house, that the pre-vaccination questions that get asked, if you ask, you have to craft those so carefully, because if you ask things about their family members' medical history, you're asking about your employees' medical history, and that's impermissible. And so under GINA, you just have to be so careful. So if you're going to have an in-house vaccination, and you're going to offer these incentives, and you're going to offer, to family members, take so much care in crafting that. Yeah. Let's see. Oh, and I have a note for myself. Make sure you work with legal counsel on that. Yes. This slide was about asking the questions, about make sure that you have crafted those carefully. I forgot to advance the slide. So there we go. Here we are. 2, in summary. In summary, as an employer, you have a duty to create a safe workplace, and you have a duty to prevent COVID infections within your business. And part of that is deciding what your stand on vaccines will be, whether they're going to be mandatory or whether they're going to be voluntary. And if they're going to be mandatory, you need to remember to make reasonable accommodations for disability, pregnancy, and religious beliefs. And of course, whatever policy you create can't create where, some protected classes, have an impact on them that, other people don't. And then, if voluntary, an incentive program might just do the trick, but watch out that the incentives don't create a coercive effect. So I have another question. Can you talk about the use of PPE and social distancing if you have a voluntary policy? Those who are not vaccinated, would it be considered coercive if unvaccinated employees must wear PPE? No, Mary. In fact, if you have a voluntary policy, those who are not vaccinated, you need to have a dual track policy. If you are vaccinated, you can go about your business free as can be. If you are unvaccinated, in order for you to not be breaching your duty under OSHA, you must require those unvaccinated people to wear masks, do social distancing, all of those things to prevent the spread. So yeah, PPE is an important aspect of having, well, both policies, whether it's reasonable accommodations under mandatory vaccination or keeping your workplace OSHA compliant if you have a voluntary vaccination policy. So we have a few more minutes, and I certainly would welcome other questions people have if you want to put them in the chat, or if not, we can certainly break for lunch a little bit early. That's up to you. So I'll give it a few minutes. I see Tammy's typing something. Thank you, Tammy. Oh, and I see Mary as well. Do I have any examples of voluntary or non-voluntary policies? Well, the thing about that, Tammy, is that what a policy needs to look like and how it needs to really function depends, primarily on the nature of that particular business. I mean, if we're going to look at like a broad category of voluntary or mandatory, mandatory would be all employees must be vaccinated for COVID-19 by either by such and such date or before returning to work physically in the office, unless subject to one of these exceptions, right? And then whatever the reasonable accommodations would need to be would depend on that workplace and their the nature of their business and the nature of the work that particular person does. And voluntary would be, we encourage you to be vaccinated, and we are willing to incentivize you if an incentive is something that you're interested in, to encourage, right? And if you are not going to be, if you choose not to be vaccinated, then you are required to continue to wear your mask, social distance, and all that. Okay, so Mary asks, can you address travel as it relates to mandatory policy for vaccination, visiting clients, attending events? Well, all right, so the only thing I have to say about travel, Mary, the whole thing about whether it should be mandatory or voluntary, your choice, has to do with if you are requiring it for people to travel, and then there's certain classes of people who have more difficulty, you just need to make sure that you're not running afoul of the disparate impact for protected classes. So that's where and that's true generally too of travel. Like if you require travel, and there's some people who have, let's say, barriers to getting passports, and they must have a passport in order to do this job, you need to be able to remove those barriers. So that's really, travel comes in more on that aspect than necessarily on the COVID aspect. So I see Mary's preparing another question, so I appreciate that. Oh, so Mary was thinking if this is a core function of the position without a reason not to vaccinate. Well, I mean, if it's a core function, yeah, I mean, certainly, if it were a core function, like you. So, well, let me go back. Let's think that through. If it's a core function, you're saying that they cannot travel because of the disability, or they cannot travel because of the vaccine, or they want to travel but don't want to vaccinate. Well, if they want to travel, and I mean, at this point, you don't have to have a vaccine to travel. You can travel, right? Well, I don't know. I guess it's going to come down to If some places do require a vaccine in order for you to travel, if they will not get a vaccine because of one of the protected reasons, but they're required to have the vaccine in order to travel, and they're required to travel for their business, then it very well may be that there's no accommodation, right? But as far as if there's a way for them to travel and be able to do that with masks and social distancing, then yeah, that would be allowed. They'd be allowed to do that essential function. And you're concerned about their safety and those they visit. Well, for sure. I mean, as that's the thing. It's like, as an employer, you're not required to make an absolute guarantee that nobody ever comes into any sort of danger risk, but you are required to create as safe as an environment as you reasonably can. That's the balance, right? People's individual needs and rights, as opposed to the rights of the collective. So this is going to be the last question, because we are now coming to the end of our time. If we write up a voluntary vaccination survey policy for employees to then use to implement PPE standards, can we include visitors and contractors that visit on site in providing vaccination status voluntarily to comply with specific PPE protocols while working with our employees? Okay, so as a business, you can always set a policy that says something like, in order to, for customers, in order to be on our facility, you either must be vaccinated or, wear PPE, right? You have that right. When it comes to contractors, whether it's sort of, you can't make a mandatory policy for contractors unless there's a very specific kind of set of guidelines that happens. So Alex, that's one of those things that if you do have contractors that you have in your space, you'll definitely want to work through that with legal counsel before you make it mandatory. But the voluntary one is going to always work. You as a business owner always have the right to say, people who come into our space must be wearing PPE if you're not vaccinated. But don't set a policy where you have your employees inspecting your customers' vaccine records. That's not going to work out. Either you can say everyone who comes into our space must be masked, if you really do have that as a concern. So we are at the end of our time, and yeah, if any of you would like assistance figuring out what would be the right thing for your particular workplace or your particular situation, we, the attorneys at Lucera Legal, would be delighted to work with you. Most of the work that we do is on like a flat fee, no surprise price basis. And so we do that so that you can determine if the value of the work that we do is exceeds the price, and if it's worth it for you. So thank you for your time and attention today. I appreciate it, and look for this recording to go out by email along with the book. And yeah, and I wish you all the best. So thanks so much, everybody.